Hello and welcome to round one of the candidates stage of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. And this is your commentator Mugwort commentating on my own round one match versus mastertan. So we have two Aussies. This was played on the 8th of August. It's a live video recording. I'm not that skillful with my speech, so it's post-match audio recording. Just giving some thoughts about this 10-game match. So it's going to be a 10-game match regardless of whether it's a tie 5-all or otherwise. 10 games of 3+2 Crazy House. So I'm taking the white pieces in round one, in game one. And playing the opening fairly quickly. Mastertan, one of the 12 players in the candidates. It's going to be a round robin. And mastertan is one of those players who's a little bit unpredictable in the opening. So last time we had a match in the knockout stage, he played this quiet opening with e6, d6, and knight f6, bishop d7. And this time a more open game where he's grabbed a pawn on d4, bishop e3, and he's played the first real surprise, which is queen d7, very unusual move. Most people prefer queen b4, and just targeting the pawn on b2, which is undefended. So bishop b5 makes sense. The other choice was just to stick a pawn on d5, attack the knight. So one idea is to trade and then knight at e5 and try and build up pressure on the square d7. Other idea is just pawn at d5 and try and win a piece back. This is played on Saturday evening, Sydney time. He's played e6, just stopping the idea of pawn at d5. So now I'm looking at knight f3 and probably trading, and then knight e5. And I think trading on c6 was also quite decent. And knight at e5. Perhaps even better, because now he's got pawn at d6, and if I want to play that same idea, I have to sacrifice a knight on e5. But I'm always tempted by a sacrifice. I've already given up a pawn for a very active position. All four minor pieces developed, and black hasn't done much except take the extra pawn and then try and protect himself. I decided to castle first and see if black just wants to play normal moves like knight f6 and bishop e7. Because I'm going to strike with bishop takes c6 at some point. It's only a matter of when. So just while mastertan is thinking, the previous Crazyhouse World Championship candidate stage have been based on match results, which means you either get 1 point for winning the match or no points for losing the match and half a point for drawing. But this year it's going to be a bit different with the scores. It's going to be based on game points, and that means every single game counts. So if you're losing 5-0 or 5-1 or even 6-1, then you still got to fight all the way to the 10 games. You got to play the whole match out, because every single point counts. So I've decided to sacrifice a piece with bishop takes, as I've been talking about before, and knight at e5. I'm thinking about whether to take first. You probably end up sacking the queen, because pawn at b7 is going to be dangerous, deflecting the bishop, whether he trades queens or not. I decided to play this move first, because now he's the one that has to calculate if bishop takes b7, does he get mated? Nevertheless, it's a very strong attack, which he doesn't want to allow, so I'm assuming, yeah, he's going to block and let me make a queen. Probably bishop at b7, just to protect that queen side a little bit, in case I get another pawn for b7. And In this position, tempo is quite important if I still want to maintain some initiative, so I decided to sacrifice the fake queen and then rook at b8 check. He's going to block on d8. And looking at playing very directly with knight takes e5 and exchanging queens. So these are the real queens. I get a queen back in hand. Now I'm a little bit too concerned about bishop takes h2. This is really nothing to worry about because I can always sidestep if I need to with king h1 and then he doesn't have a follow-up. So I should have been trading queens and then playing queen back on f8 immediately. There's no need to defend. I mean, rook ad1 is fine, I suppose. Was it necessary? Just to make him waste one more piece to block. But yeah, queen at f8 was the move here. I should have just played it straight away without thinking, knowing that king h1 is always safe. But it's when I get into these 20 or 30 second thinks, I start being too overcautious. Especially in a candidates match. It's important to stay aggressive. Threaten mate in 1 with bishop at e8. Pretty much forcing queen at e8. And then the idea was to take on d8. So get the knight and the queen. And that should be enough to mate. If he takes back with the queen, I have a knight at c5 check. If he takes with the king, trade queens and pawn at d7 check. And it's made in 4 or 5 after that. Because I already have a knight for c5 and a bishop and a queen in hand and a bishop. So I decided to play bishop at g3 just for safety. It's pretty hard to believe that I'm going to get attacked anytime soon. Opening the f file as well. Threatening stuff like rook takes f7, knight moves, and queen at e8. So bishop at f6 blocking the f file. I didn't think there was really any other purpose, so now is a good time for queen at f8. Yeah, letting the time run too low is a common mistake. Just put the queen on, there's really nothing to think about. And again, I shouldn't really even calculate this, but rook takes d8 check is just a good move because my king is safe. Even if I can't find a checking sequence that leads to mate, rook takes d8 is still a really useful knight to pick up. I could even follow up with knight at c5 if I can't find any good checks after that. But yeah, pawn at g5 was a bit of a waste because now he's putting knights on with tempo. I'm not getting mated yet, but I do have to be careful in defense. So queen at h5 is a dangerous move. I should respond. Probably the most active defense there is bishop at e5 because then I'm threatening rook takes d8, bishop c7 with check. And now queen at e1 is okay. Again, bishop at e5 is the most active defense. But I missed the move here with 3 seconds left. Queen takes e2. Queen takes e2 is just completely winning. But now, yeah, I'm forced to sack a lot of material back and let him do lots of checks in a row with the initiative. It's still not over yet because he's giving me one more move after the rook check and queen takes d1. So I can't stop the mate, but I still have a chance if he doesn't move the king to the right square with pawn at d7 check. And sacking the bishop amazingly should have led to a draw after f takes and knight at f8 check, which was my first thought. I changed my mind. The idea was king e7, knight at g6, h takes, knight takes, king d7, knight f8, and it is a repetition. But after knight at c5, which was played in the game with 0.46 seconds left, king e7, and I eventually ran out of checks. So it was not only a time win, I was also lost in the position. But yeah, I missed an amazing draw by repetition with my first thought, which was knight at f8 check. So exciting game 1. It's a bit of a shame to lose with the white pieces in the first game though, after such a dominating opening position. So let's move on to game 2. It's e4, e5. He's played an early bishop e2. And I don't think trading on c3 was such a great idea because he probably can get away with d takes, pawn at h3, and trading queens if he finds the right follow up. But yeah, taking back with the b pawn, it means black is always going to have this long-term initiative on h3 and g2. So I guess he didn't see a direct continuation after d takes and trading queens and pawn at h3. It's something where you have to find the exact move, otherwise you just lost with this pawn at h3 and h takes g2 after the queen trade. So perfectly understandable why b takes c3 was played in the game. Although in theory I do think d takes is the most critical move. So bishop d6, just stopping any immediate attack with knight takes e5. I'm happy to trade pieces because knight at h3 is going to be deadly in the end. So knight at h5 castles, and he comes up with an interesting move here, pawn at f6. So the idea is to build up a quick counterattack by exchanging a knight and a pawn. So if I go g takes, he's probably going to follow up bishop takes c6, and I do have to be careful not to allow him to sacrifice a piece for a pawn with multiple attacks in different directions, something like knight takes e5, and then it's total mayhem who's got the first attack. So I thought, well, I can let him take on g7, even pick up the rook, as long as I get rid of that knight on h5. So I think bishop g4 is a good move. I mean, probably g takes f6 is not too bad. It just feels a bit scary if you don't really know what's going on. So bishop g4, nothing wrong with this. If knight takes g7, there is no threat. So I can just keep attacking, or queen f6 for example. So I'm assuming he's going to go f takes g7, bishop takes h5, g f8, queen, and probably bishop takes f8. And he has a rook to put on in defense on a square like g3. So this is what I'm expecting. And planning to play an aggressive defense with pawn at g4. And just waiting for him to take back on g2 and then put the knights on to attack the rook. That's the basic battle plan. I do want to get rid of that rook quickly so I can make some serious mating threats. Another idea is simply to block out the g file and to threaten g takes f3. So it's a little bit too late for mastertan to avoid trades because I already have enough pieces to cause some serious trouble. So it's either knight at h3, even knight at f5 could be good. So he's done more trades, I'm quite happy with that. Knight at h3, knight at f4 coming. I just want to win the rook with pawn at g2 to follow. Rook takes, knight takes. And see which piece he wants to save, because the bishop's hanging, the knight's on pre. And the bishops and queen do a great job in defense on h5, f8, d8. So there's no counterattack for mastertan. So he can't afford to take the knight on g2, but he also can't afford to just leave it there and let it come back, and then there's going to be multiple mate threats. So it is already looking winning for black. And there's no need even to take the rook on e1, because it's really control of the square g2 that I'm fighting for here. So just bring the knight back to f4. Try and pick up the bishop on c6 if I can. Or if he replaces g2 with a pawn, then go rook at h1. Again, pieces hanging everywhere. So, just about impossible for white to defend. Yeah, so I need a diagonal piece for g2. Just going to take the bishop. Ignore everything else. And getting ready to play rook at h1 upon pawn at g2. Yeah, it's looking more and more like a game over with every move. So mastertan and I had a match in the knockout. It was 6-3 in my favor, where we stopped the match before we played game 10. Because in a knockout, well, in that stage, the winner went on to the candidates. The loser still got to play the elimination bracket. And mastertan went on to defeat Shabrat and Anjur Nakamura to qualify. And so I've almost pre-moved g takes h3, missed a mate in one with bishop takes g2. Lucky for me, it didn't really make a difference because the position is so dominating anyway. And so the queen g5 to build up an attack on g2, or rook takes h2 is also good. The main thing is that there's no counterplay for white. Black king is super safe. I didn't want to just bury the rook on h1, so rook takes h2. I'm not even worried about. I don't even think I noticed it at all in the game that I missed a mate in one with bishop at g2. I wasn't too bothered though. It is pretty hard to lose this one, although I do have an ability to stuff up any winning position. But it will be pretty hard to lose this. Okay, so the match score is 1-all. And let's see if mastertan wants to repeat. No, he's playing the French. Or thought he might have gone back to d6, but no, e6, a6. So we have a new opening. I don't have anything special against this, so I'm almost out of book already. Bishop d3, c5. And often I would take on c5 and replace it with pawn at d4, but because I've already played bishop d3, perhaps it's not the best move order. I should just go back to an open Sicilian with knight f3. And d5 is also an ambitious try getting more into a chess-like position where there's no trades. But there's nothing wrong with white's position here. Perhaps a cautious move like h3 just to stop mastertan's next move, bishop g4. a4 is what you do in chess to avoid any queenside expansion. a4 and a5, but in Crazyhouse. I was hoping to have time to pick up a knight for b6. It just didn't turn out to be such a great idea after all. Probably knight bd2 would be good, but I was a little worried about knight takes d5. Does leave a gaping hole on d5 even after bishop takes knight takes e7. I'm not really sure whether it's worth it though, so I just decided in the end to take on f6. And I didn't realize the danger that I was in, because I thought, okay, he's got this nice outpost. He's let me the square b6 for the knight. But after rook a7, yeah, the knight's not actually doing very much on b6. So again, knight bd2 was the move, just to harmonize the pieces, to defend the knight on f3 again. So I can then answer knight at f4 with rook g1 or even bishop f1. It's not too bad. But yeah, I've seriously underestimated these piece drops with queen g3, bishop at f4, queen g4, h5 coming. The queen is going to be either trapped or I have to allow knight takes g2 check. So there is already no good response to knight at h4. So I've completely mishandled this opening, trying to play too many chess-like moves. And probably as I noticed before, as I announced before, pawn at h3 much earlier to avoid bishop g4 would have avoided all this stuff with the early trades, and knight at h4. Or knight bd2 was another way to avoid it. But yeah, the two bishops on the light squares are just useless in defense. King f8 is very safe. And I really have no choice, nothing better than to give up the queen with knight d2. Unfortunately, also the pawn on a5 is hanging with check. So this is already looking pretty bad. Yeah, that being 2.5 minutes down on the clock doesn't help, but I'm just barely surviving in the position at the moment, so yeah, nothing better than knight d2. So king f1, my only hope is that there's no immediate mate and I can drop the two knights on with tempo. So pushing the bishop away with g4, knight at c4. But even though I finally get in this move, knight at b6, it does absolutely nothing. And again, as announced before, he's just going to answer rook a7 and then pawn at c7 to kick the knight away. So if you are watching this video and you're new to Crazyhouse, and there is really no such thing as a permanent outpost. So positional features are much more transitory and impermanent than in chess. The pawn at c7, the knight is actually trapped on b6. So mastertan's played a pretty much flawless game from start to finish. Yeah, I've opened up the h file for him. Everything is hanging. Pawn on h3, the pawn on g5. And it's pretty much resignable because there's no counterattack whatsoever. So well played, Mastertan. He takes the lead 2-1. Let's see if we have a similar opening. I'm expecting a Ralapez or a Scotch or something a bit different. 4 knights. Deciding which system to go for, bishop c5 or bishop e7. The most aggressive, bishop c5, but also the most theoretical if he goes for the main lines. So I'm sure he's deciding if and when to deviate, or rather when to deviate from the main lines. So bishop g5, knight g5 are the main moves here, but he decides on h3. So because he's played a slightly cautious move, I decided to go for something very aggressive, which is to sack the bishop. And you can do this with the opposite colors. And if you watch a Clearcast stream, because he was commentating live with a short delay, and he also noticed this often happens with opposite colors, where white plays pawn at g6 and black is defending with bishop at e6. Alright, here we go. So undermining the bishop slightly. He doesn't want to allow pawn at d4, so he'll take back with the bishop, trade bishops. And I'm expecting rook takes f2. Perhaps he didn't want the rook harassed with bishop at c5 or pawn at g3. So, not quite sure whether to drop the bishop with check first or pawn at g4. Even pawn at f4 seemed okay, just to block the bishop from c1. Make connect 4 from c7 to f4. But decided to go for the move which exchanges all the pawns on the king's side and leave his king a bit bare. He's also got to make a decision whether to leave that knight hanging on f3 or not. So now he's giving me the choice. Do I take the knight? Do I take the pawn? They both look quite okay. And actually, pawn takes f3, queen takes f3 seemed like the most risky at the time because there's a big threat. Then bishop takes f6, and that cripples the pawns on the king side. So I decided the safer option was g takes h3, even though I discovered after the match g takes f3, queen takes, and knight at h2 seemed like a pretty good alternative, but I was quite happy with this in the game. Just make sure he doesn't take the pawn on h3. So the first moves I'm looking at are knight g4 check or bishop at b6 check. And then I'm looking at pawn at g4 or bishop at g4. But I finally noticed the best defense with the pawn on h3 is, well, as often, the most aggressive move, which is bishop at g2. Because then I can decide, if he leaves the rook on h1, leaves the knight on f3, I can decide which piece to trade at the right time. And it really depends whether he follows up with knight d5 or pawn at h6. Depends on how he attacks as to which piece I may pick up. So I was half expecting him to just move the rook with rook g1, but then it's not so human to admit your mistake and have to move the rook so many times. So I don't think many people would actually move the rook again. Even though rook g1 may be the best move, it's a bit hard to tell. I was quite comfortable here, having picked up 2 pawns for a piece. So after a long think, mastertan decides on, well, probably the most aggressive move from his perspective. It's going to be knight d5. And if this was a 1-0 game, I would just take the knight immediately. But of course, I do want to think about it a little bit because he's not even forced to take the queen. There's also pawn takes knight or bishop takes d5. And then I have to decide, do I want to save the queen? Do I want to sack it on g5 and get a few minor pieces and attack the king immediately? Do I want to leave the queen hanging and take the knight or the rook on h1? So we've all got decisions to make on every move. Nothing is completely forced at this stage. So yeah, he decided taking the queen. There was too much and too sudden an attack, and his counter-attack was a little bit slow because he didn't have an immediate threat on the next move. So just picking up the rook, I simply want to play rook at g2 next. Thinking about pawn at g2, but I'm not quite sure what happens on queen takes h3, assuming he'll play queen takes h1 next. So reasonably happy with rook at g2, assuming king e1. And I'm looking at either pawn at f2 check or knight d4. So knight d4, the idea is to trade the knight on f3, and then there's a big hold on f3 that he has to cover. And all this time, he really can't afford to take the queen because the counterattack is too strong. So it does look pretty good for black here. Pawn takes, big threat of knight at f3 that he has to defend. And okay, what do I have on pawn at f2 check? King f1. Is there a follow-up? Knight at g3 check, king takes g2, f1 equals queen, I think would have been the strongest continuation, but I'm just playing safety first here, so leaving the white king wide open. So I didn't see that other line during the game. This is a post-match commentary after all, so I get some extra insights. Rook at e2, pawn at f2, I didn't actually see the finish of the game just yet. I'm just playing the only move that looks like it leads to an attack, so I really have to sack the queen. Knight at f4. I think I missed a mate in 2 here with a bishop at e2 and bishop at e3 mate. But it's still, yeah, rook at bishop at c1 was a clever mate in 2, just to make him block that square with the rook. But yeah, bishop at d2 check does lead to mate just in time, half a second left. Knight takes rook e1, or otherwise rook e1 anyway if king b1 promotes and mate on the first rank. So yeah, it should have been more comfortable than that in terms of the time, because black was winning in the position for a long time. But yeah, I do like to do this to myself for some strange reason. Leave myself with only a couple of seconds left. Alright, so match score is 2 games all. I'm out of book already on move 5. I've never seen this knight b8 before. Most people take on f3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, knight e5. And then the plan is usually to play rook g1 and find a way to harass the knight on e5 quickly. Ideas of playing bishop at a4 at some point. Try and use these weak and light squares on c6, e6, d7. Alright, but bishop e2 is pretty sensible. I didn't see any point of going bishop b5 check, c6. So bishop e2, queen d7. And before he has a chance to play e6, I did want to make a big dent in those light squares. So I'm looking at knight g5. With the idea to exchange bishops and also perhaps to sack the knight on f7 and pawn at e6 check. It especially works well with the queen on d7. So expecting a bishop trade, and then probably he's going to put the bishop back on g4 or h5. And I was seriously considering queen takes h5 if bishop at h5. But yeah, f3 is also perfectly fine. And with the same ideas to build up an attack via knight takes f7 or perhaps bishop at e6. I don't quite think bishop at a4 goes anywhere at the moment. It's more the squares e6 and f7 that I'm looking at invading. So I'm sure he really wants to play e6, but he's hesitating because a lot of these trades come very quickly and then his queen gets kicked around. Probably if he plays at e6, then he never gets to castle. So f3, very natural move, bishop h5, bishop at f5. I thought he would sack the queen because if queen d8, well, I mean, he's never going to get in the move e6, which means all his pieces become passive if queen d8. And I can even take my time, there's no rush to build up the attack. So here almost played knight takes f7 and pawn at e6. But decided, well, why not play g4? Because he has no pieces in hand. There's no way he can take advantage of this very slight weakness quickly. If he had a knight for d4 and some other pieces to take advantage of the hole on g2, perhaps. But it is Crazyhouse after all, not Bughouse. So that means I have full control over which pieces will be traded. So he's trying to get that knight, I assume, for d4. But even if he plays knight at d4, I'm going to keep the queen off board for a queen at a4 check. And that way, that actually turns out to win a piece for free. So yeah, so many good options. It's either g takes h5 or knight takes f7. Even knight e6 is not that bad. So if you sack a piece for a couple of minors, then you really can't afford to have too many of your minor pieces buried like this, because I mean, the positional factors far outweigh the material in this sort of position. He just doesn't have any pieces near my king. The only dangerous looking drop knight at d4 is covered by queen at a4 check. And even if I didn't have queen at a4 check, I could just go g takes f6, knight takes e2, f7, take another minor piece, and it should be a quick mate to follow. So there seems very little for black to play for in this position. And the idea of g5 is to trade a pawn for f7. And he does have king d8, but I can always pick up the bishop on g8 and get some material back. Yeah, so there was really not much for black to do. Of course, he can't take on e2 now because c takes b7 is check. So he's giving up this piece. I could take on f6, but I didn't see any quick way to finish after that, so I decided to take a pawn for f7. And I really should have no problems converting this. It's either f takes g8 or knight at g6. I was trying to win some more material. So knight takes, bishop moves, and I realized quickly that a new knight on f7 is going to lead to a quick mate, so yeah, there's a knight hanging. Queen takes c6 is the move. So now it's something like mate in 7 or mate in 8 with the best moves for white. So he's trying to prolong the game with bishop takes e6 and make me sack a lot of queens, but yeah, there's surely going to be a mate on queen takes e6, b takes c6, knight at b7 check, and bishop at f7 to follow. So here, just trying to do it all with check. So starting out with knight at f7. Yeah, there may be a mate with one of the queens taking d7, but I didn't want to bother looking into that. So I can grab a pawn with knight takes d6 check, but I first needed to seal off the king. So it's a semi-smothered mate with a rook at d8 check, and then knight takes d6 to follow. So mate in 4 and pawn at f7. Okay, so this is a very convincing game 5. 3 games to 2 lead. And actually this was the first game in the match where white won. So black is actually leading 4 games to 1. Mastertan has now switched to d4. Going with this e6 system, which was successful against the match, in the match versus De Blauw-Zau, and I have another video on that. So bishop b4. Did we play this? I think we did play this exact move order. I'm trying to slow down white playing e4 because then it'd be very tempting to sack the queen via knight takes e4, bishop takes d8, and then knight takes c3. And this also seems to work well for black. I'm not sure whether I've had this exact position because Mastertan here played bishop at h4. So he's leaving the pawn on c3. And the idea is to make a quick dent on g7 after bishop takes and g takes f6. So the safest move seems like knight takes g5, bishop takes, and perhaps bishop at e7. But the more critical is certainly knight takes c3. So picking up the offered material, I didn't have to take the queen. I could have just gone g takes f6, because knight at g7 is, after all, only a check. King f8, I mean, he still has to pick up a bit more material to cause any serious threats. So I have a new position here, and it took me a little bit of time to notice that if his knight is ever on h5, I can pick it up with queen at a5 check. So I decided not to go for the check immediately, although there's probably nothing wrong with queen at a5 check. And I was also seriously looking into queen takes f6, bishop takes, g takes, knight at g7, king d8. But then I realized more dangerous is queen at g7, not knight at g7. It's very hard to defend everything. I decided in the end to go for g takes f6, knight at g7, king f8. With a simple trap, if he goes back to h5, then I have this queen at a5 long distance fork. Okay, so what should white do? Does he leave the knight on g7? And I don't want to rush into king takes because knight at h5 is coming with check and then f6 is falling. So after mastertan's next move, which is bishop d3, my first thought was actually pawn at g6, just to try to slow down the build up on f6 with knight h5. And I really shouldn't be rushing into this queen. I really shouldn't play any check at all. I think this was just a waste of a move. Bishop at a5 check. He's going to play king f1. I think the move there instead of bishop at a5 was queen at g4. Probably rook g8 is good too. But yeah, queen g4 hits in all directions. But yeah, it's still, I've got some ideas to play pawn at h3 if the knight moves. So I think I should be playing pawn at h3 without too much hesitation. And also queen at g4 is not too bad, but yeah, this move is dubious because it blocks the g file. It actually makes it harder to attack on g2. And even if I do get in the move, g takes f3, he can respond g takes f3, queen at g2, king e2, and the king is quite safe. So this is also a good in-between move because it blocks the g file. It means, yeah, he can take back on f3. He's still got threats to take my queen and follow up with knight at f6 check. And I don't have enough pieces to build up an attack on g2. So sacking the queen is no good because knight takes comes with check. He can always defend on the next move if he doesn't have a force mate. And queen at h3, yeah, does pick up the knight, but there's really no attack after pawn at g2. So I really have to stop knight at f6 by taking the bishop, but then, yeah, this move doesn't really help at all. Just rook takes, and he found a force mate in 4, so I don't think king takes bishop was any better after queen at f8 check. So yeah, that's it. So he's found the correct move order to do it all with check. Yeah, but my mistakes came earlier. I think once the bishop got to f6, it was already quite difficult to hold that position. Yeah, and I think I never should have checked with the bishop on a5. I should just keep the pieces off board and wait for the right time, and rather than committing to the check. So scoreline is back to 3 games all. And if it is a draw 5 all, it doesn't really benefit either of us because remember, This Candidates in 2020, it's all about the game points. So it favors the players who get big score lines and take risks and go for big score lines, 7-3 or 8-2 or 9-1. So also the players who are very consistent and who can win, 6-4, they're not likely to win. Even if you win every match 6-4, you're probably not likely to win the Candidates. So out of 11 matches, what would you end up with? 66 points? I think players like Jasugi are going to end up with closer to 75 or 80 points in the end. So even 6-4 every match is probably not going to cut it. Not going to be enough. But yeah, certainly no easy matches at all, with even players like mastertan, variants only, they are in reality at least 2500 strength. So forget about their current rating. And there's certainly no easy matches at all. So the idea of this sequence with knight at e3 and d5 knight takes is to threaten bishop b5, which is a bit awkward to defend because, as you can see, black is suffering from a lack of development. Although the material is equal, he doesn't want to have to waste time playing a move like a6. So the immediate threat is bishop b5, winning a queen for a piece, with the threat, or with the idea of knight takes c7 check. And I have a secondary idea, even if he plays a6 or stops the threat somehow. There is a secondary idea to prevent castling permanently with pawn at e7. So, although it may seem tempting to play pawn at b5 in the hope a takes b5, but he can just bring the queen back to d7 and then b takes a6, probably just b takes a6, avoiding too many trades. And it's not so clear how to follow up. But I thought white is getting a huge attack after pawn at e7. Bishop takes, knight takes, king takes. And yeah, simply just bishop g5 check. Try and provoke him to play f6. Or perhaps at some moment, if f6, I could drop a pawn on d6 to block the queen from covering the 6th rank. Wasn't quite sure yet how to proceed, but this is sort of what I was expecting. So the idea to build up a quick initiative before he has time to put the pieces off board back on. And the time advantage is certainly helping as well. So, pawn at e7. Already had the idea 2 minutes ago. I'm just double checking I've got nothing better. Yeah, I didn't need to spend a minute on this move because, well, actually, what mastertan did in the game is kind of tricky with queen e4, with the idea of queen b4 and queen takes e7. So it does make me think how to respond, because the first move I was thinking is queen e2, but then perhaps it doesn't make too much of a difference if the queen ends up on e7, and then I'm going to block with bishop at c3 anyway and play bishop g5. It is actually better to keep the queen on the d file, so what I did I think was best, because then obviously if the queen moves to the wrong square there's an immediate mate with queen d8. So he's really forced to sacrifice the queen. Can't really take it back. So leaving the bishop on e7. I could just bring it back to g5 or back to a3, back to f6 even, sack the bishop. But decided, yeah, whatever I can trade must be good for white, so knight g5. He's blocked out the d-file momentarily. So take the bishop. And I'm not sure which way this bishop should go back to. Bishop h4, he could probably castle it. Castle if it's still legal. Bishop a3, he might even have the idea to castle the other way. Although that looks terribly risky with bishop takes a6. Sacking the queen on d5 becomes an option. Some combination of sacking the bishop and the queen and keeping up the checks. Okay, but I decided to try to prevent castling permanently with bishop at g5, assuming that he's going to take the bishop on e7 eventually to free himself of this bind. And now is a good time to sack the queen, because my first thought was queen at e6, but actually pawn at e6 is even better because there are multiple threats. And of course, a mate in one threat with queen at d7 that he has to cover. And giving up a knight, that's really the piece that I need, because now there is also the threat to play knight at f6 and knight at g7, as well as just moving the bishop out of the way. So yeah, it's a mate in two. Okay, pretty happy with that game. Scoreline is now 4 games to 3. 3 to go. No matter what the result, we'll play out the 10 games. So, first time we have a Scotch in this match. Actually a Scotch Gambit, which I haven't had for a long time. Actually, or not in a big match, but I've played it a couple of times in arenas. And no one's played this knight g5 move against me. So, probably in chess, your first thought would be knight e5, attacking and defending, or d5, but I didn't want to invite too many trades because it does take some calculation. Knight e5, and then knight takes f7, bishop takes f7, and so on. So I thought pawn at e6 and bishop c5 was simpler. c3, just castle. So usually when you castle, if the opponent plays knight g5, you're pretty safe on the dark squares h6 and g7. The main attack is on the diagonal a2 to g8, but I've blocked that out for the moment. So yeah, bishop b6 is okay, but the best move here is actually just take the pawn on c3 with the idea to go pawn at b2 to follow up and trap the rook on a1. But this is still fine. b5, knight e5, bishop e2. I was intending, well, either to sack the pawn back with d3 or take on c3 and follow up with d5. But considering what happened in the game, it was a little bit more cautious to play d6, because then if he kicks the knight away to, say, g6, he can't immediately follow up with e4 to e5, which is what happened in the game. So I did not notice this during the game. It's actually important to play the move d6 here to slow down white's attack. So Master 10 played the next few moves very precisely. Pawn at f4, knight g6, e5. I thought about sacking the piece, but I didn't even really feel that safe with the queen out on f6. So I decided just to keep the pieces on the board and play passively for the moment with knight d7. Yeah, so this is also a good move because it shuts in the bishop on c8, whereas if he traded on d5 it would have opened the bishop, which would eventually be useful for a pawn at h3 once the knight on g5 has been kicked away. So if I can avoid too many trades, because black is a pawn ahead, then I should be fairly comfortable. But also mastertan's next move is very accurate. After knight d7, he played bishop d3, with the idea to bring the queen to h5 and also to sack on h7 and follow up with pawn at h5. So really wasn't sure whether to block the diagonal with pawn at f5, try to avoid all trades. And I still didn't feel that comfortable on queen h5, h6, maybe a sack on f7, knight takes f7, or knight takes e6 is also possible. And he could also pick up 2 pawns for a piece any time with knight takes d5 and bishop takes f5. So I thought pawn at h6 on move 14 was safest, but then I really should have just taken the material and defended, even passively, with knight at h8 or perhaps knight at h4. But if I give the material back like I did in the game, I was going for king safety. That's the main reason why I played knight c5, well, hoping to get time to trade for the bishop, but he's going knight takes f8 and bishop takes g6. But I thought because the f-file is open, I'd have enough defense around the king. But the queen is, which mastertan brilliantly pointed out in this game, the queen is the worst defensive piece when the opponent can trade pawns and has knights and rooks in hand. So g takes f6 doesn't help, and he's just going to keep dropping pieces to harass the queen. So perhaps king f7 is the most stubborn defense, but then there's always knight c takes d5 and getting more pawns in hand. And then eventually rook at g8 to hit the queen at the right time. So I really have no choice. I have to give the queen back. He's going to play queen at e7. And yeah, he's just going to overrun me by dropping pieces and threatening stuff like pawn at f7. And he could immediately promote to a queen on pawn at f7, king h7. I guess he's trying to do everything with check. Yeah, promoting is just immediately game over, promoting to a queen, because there's no counterattack. But I'll try and hold on to as much material as I can. Bishop at g7 is just a killer because he gets the piece back, with threats to play knight at f8 and knight at e7 mate. So I really have to cover the square f8. But yeah, he's going to keep oscillating between knight at f6 and knight at f8. Take, and then f6 is a square I have to cover. But also bishop at g8 is a mating threat. So yeah, this is too much. Rook at g7, he has knight at f6 mate. Yeah, too many squares to cover, so that's game over. Mate in 2. And we have a scoreline of 4 games all. So it's looking more and more like a tie, with every game heading towards a 5-all. But let's see. Let's try and do better in game 10 with the black pieces at least. So mastertan's going back to e6 and a6. I decided not to play bishop d3 this time and go knight f3, anticipating he'll play c5, but no, bishop d3. And now I could have just left it there and castle, but decided to try and gain a tempo with pawn at d4. Was half expecting bishop a7. No, bishop e7. I'm just going to castle and try and play rook e1. So most of these type of positions, the knight is already out on c3, but this is a little bit different because there are options to play a4, tempting black to play b4, and yeah, a chess-like style. You'd bring the knight to to b2 to d2 and c4 in that case. So options to play a4, but I wanted to guard the pawn on e4, so there's no tricks with pawn at c4. Although even giving up the bishop via c takes d3, c takes d3 to close down the long diagonal is not so bad. Because I think if that diagonal is closed, then the white king is always going to be safer than the black king. But once he's played knight f6, I think e5, although it seems risky, is certainly an aggressive way to play, because the obvious drawback is that it opens the bishop on b7, but it does build up an attack and try and take advantage of the fact there's a gap on c7, so the square d6 is extremely weak. So again, it's an idea to play a4, b4, maybe c4. The move I was most worried about here is pawn at g4. So perhaps knight c3 is critical, but I thought bishop e4 would be useful, just to counterpose this bishop on b7 in case the knight ever moves away. I was actually expecting pawn at f5, but he's played pawn to f5, which gives me this extra option to en passant, because you can't en passant a pawn that's placed on the board, but you can en passant a pawn that has moved 2 squares. Just like in chess. So here I was talking about this weakness on d6, so I'm trying to highlight this before he has a chance to castle. And then trying to decide whether to play pawn at e4 to close down the diagonal, or whether to go for the bishop on f6 immediately with a move like pawn at e5 or pawn at g5. And the third option here is to try and trade for that bishop with knight c3. So I thought now is a good time for knight c3, because I do favor this trade. I think it's good for white if I can go knight takes d5. You could say that this move comes with tempo. Yeah, I was expecting him to play a move like bishop at c6 just to try and maintain the pressure on the diagonal. But instead the move in the game was pawn at c7. So I think if he lets me take on d5, I'm just going to do it anyway without thinking too much. Not that I have time to think too much here, because I was out of book on about move 5 or so. And rather than come back now with knight f5, I thought it's a good time to counterattack the bishop, because he certainly doesn't want to end up with tripled pawns, because then none of them would guard the square e7, of course. I'm going to make a weakness on e7, that's the whole plan. So actually expecting the bishop to come back to e7, now knight f5. So intending not only to take the bishop, but also threatening knight takes g7 and then replacing the pawn on f6. So of course happy if he takes, and then queen on f6 is just vulnerable to a pin with bishop at e5. Otherwise he's got to step back to a light square. Now that means bishop at d5 becomes very tempting, so I had the idea to sack the rook. If I had a pawn in hand for g7, this would be good, but never mind about that. I think rook takes e4 is the way to go, and bishop at d5. So one idea to take the pawn to keep defense, bishop takes e4 and then threaten pawn at g7. And it almost felt like a mate if he blocked with the pawn, but I think I was a pawn short with bishop at f7 and bishop takes e6. So I thought knight e5, again to slow down his attack. Again tempted to play f takes, or I didn't want to take the rook just yet because the knight is covering g7 anyway. I thought my attack would be slower. So here, just taking whatever I can, making as many holes as I can before going for the decisive attack. So yeah, g takes f6. I think if queen takes, the correct move here would have been bishop at g5, because queen takes f2, it's not going anywhere. I have enough defenders around the king in that case. Whereas I can still play bishop c to g5 next move. But what I decided on was a little bit risky because I don't have time to calculate the counter-attack with knight at h3. So after I take the queen, although technically it's still winning for white, it does look very scary to allow knight at h3, g takes, and then rook at e1 check. So with 14 seconds left, the safest move here would have been to block now with knight at f1. But I thought I had everything covered. I wasn't quite sure. I think mastertan should have spent a bit more time, because if you played bishop at c4 now on move 32, I would have had only 12 seconds to see the defense rook at e2. It's a very important move, rook at e2 to defend. Because now it's too late, because if he goes bishop at c4, I have king e3, no more checks. But if he played it on move 32, I think any other move actually loses. So rook at e2, the whole idea is pawn at g2, king takes. He can take the queen, knight takes e1 with check, but then the rook can come back to take. And then the idea is pawn at f3, king g3, queen at g2, king h4, and the bishops hold the check on g5, and then white will win. So 6 seconds here, trying to find a forced mate. I realized knight a7 doesn't work, so I wanted to open the c file. If king b7, I have knight a5 to finish, and queen takes c7. But otherwise, just a double check and mate on c7. So yeah, it would have been challenging to find the right defense with 12 seconds left if he played bishop at c4 check. And honestly, I can't say, because I didn't see rook at e2 in the game. I might have made a mistake and gone knight at d3, and then if he took the right pieces and dropped the right pieces with check, I could have easily lost that game. But yeah, rook at e2, quite an amazing and surprising defense. Was it move 33? Alright, so we got a similar opening to that in game number 8. So this will definitely be the final game in the match. And before he played an earlier c3, oh no, sorry, he did castle and then c3, so I decided to vary on move 6 with bishop e7, just because I didn't want the bishop harassed, even though my position really was not that bad, but I messed up very badly on around move 10, 11, 12. So d5 is a good time to hit the bishop with the e-file blocked. And I'm just trying to get a balance of king safety and grabbing as many pawns as I can. So just deciding which piece to take on e4. It's either d takes or knight takes e4. I'm actually anticipating he'll trade on c6, sack on f7, possibly even include a move like pawn at g6 check if he can grab a pawn in hand. But he can't do everything at the same time. So a single check on e5 is not that damaging. I was expecting him to sack a knight on f7 here and just go all in for the attack. But often players with the white pieces can be a little cautious, because if the sharpest line is to sack more pieces and then you've already given up a pawn or two and you can't see anything forcing, then there can be a tendency to just pull back a little bit and try to play sort of mediocre moves which look like they're making threats, but Just allow your opponent to put pieces on and defend. And I'm already very happy with castles here, so I'm 2 pawns ahead. And can choose to answer knight takes c6 with either queen e8 or queen d7. Even bishop d7 looks okay. I was quite happy with if he played knight takes c6. Queen takes d4. I can just trade queens and go for the attack, either pawn at f3 or pawn at e2. And the main point is here that he's a long way from a counterattack. So the 2 knights, they're mainly pressuring the square f7, but I already have 3 pieces defending. And the main idea of pawn at e2, probably pawn at f3 was objectively a better move, just to create more holes on g2 and h3. But the whole idea was that if I ever get a knight in hand, then knight at d3 looks extremely powerful. And if the queen is not guarding c2, obviously knight at c2 also. And it does look like, in the next 3 or 4 moves that I will pick up a knight in hand. The other idea is to open the d file with c5, and if d takes, then I have queen d1. So that way I'm trying to look deeply into rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, bishop takes, queen at e1, perhaps queen at e2 to follow. And if queen takes, bishop takes e2, queen back at e1, could probably then, well, I mean, rook at d1 looks okay, but even rook at f1, queen takes, bishop takes. So this is what I'm looking into, because if he only has one heavy piece ever at a time, I never have to worry about counterattacks involving rook or queen at h8. So for that to work, he would need 2 heavy pieces with the bishop on h5 gone. So I guess he's looking into something similar with taking on c5, but he decided to allow me to capture on d4. And because this was played a week ago, I'm trying to remember the move in the game. I think it was bishop f4. Yeah, we're going to see a queen exchange with queen takes d4. So because of the threat to replace the queen on f1, and then I'm going to have a pawn in hand for e2, he has to cover the square f1 by clearing the first rank, so I'm anticipating knight d2. So this is after the queen exchange on d4. And again, I'm even less worried about knight c6 attacking the queen and bishop, because it doesn't even take a pawn. If he wanted to do that, surely he should have done it last move. So we are going to trade queens. I would still like a knight in hand for c2, but I guess it's not something I should be overly concerned about. I can try and play bishop d6 if I really want a knight in hand, but... Okay, so black to play. I probably should have played pawn at f3 or bust a hole with e3. But this move was just to maintain some extra defense, to attack lots of pieces at once which are potentially en prise. I had the idea to play knight d5 next, open up the bishop for bishop takes g5. So this is about the best he can do. Queen at g3. So knight d5 coming. And mastertan after knight d5 played a very dangerous looking move, pawn at h6. So the idea is, if I ever take with g takes h6, he could perhaps take on f7, then knight takes h6 check. So actually the correct move here is to deflect the queen away with pawn at h4. Very hard to see with time running out. But there's nothing wrong with what I did in the game, which is knight takes f4, just as long as I avoid the immediate queen trade. Because after h takes g7, I should be moving the rook away with rook e8. Because then as long as I hold the queen, there's no danger. I really shouldn't let him play g takes f8 equals queen. Because a rook on the back rank, although it's not mating, it does look dangerous. I think he probably shouldn't have allowed me to take on e5 so easily. Because now the main plan is just to hit the queen with tempo. So whatever move I can do to hit the queen with tempo should be good. Bishop at h6 check coming. I'm going to block with the pawn. I've got to leave at least one knight to block the back rank in case the rook at h8. So yeah, there's a threat to play bishop at e7, so I have to take the bishop back. Even queen takes g5 was okay, surprisingly. So knight takes e4. I can just pick up that one, bishop at f3. And I should have used that pawn for d2. Pawn at d2 is just absolutely murder. But didn't see it with the 4 seconds left. He's going to grab the rook. Again, pawn at d2 should have led to a quick win. But no, it's just a mad time scramble. He sacked the rook. Maybe he thinks he has something, but not yet. If pawn at e7, I can just take. Actually, I have to watch out for a knight at h6 check. So trying to hit the queen. He had rook takes f8 and knight takes d7 check. I just got to make sure I'm not even worried about the queen. I just got to make sure I cover the square f8. So two bishops defending each other. Take on g2, threaten mate. I mean, he really has to sack the queen on g2, but he's going for the mate. It's not quite there. If I take with the bishop, it's a draw because he has the knight f7, knight h6 check repetition. But no, taking with the pawn first gives the king room. And there's no way the pieces can come in. He's only got three diagonals in hand. I've got all the checks covered. He has to sack the queen. And all right, there's really nothing that can go wrong here except the time. Oh, so it's looking like that's going to be it. Queen at f3, threatening move the knight somewhere. Actually, knight e1 and queen at g1 was made in two, but yeah, it doesn't matter. I'll just put the piece back on f3. I don't need to take that. I'll just play bishop at f3 and move the king to a dark square. No more checks. And should be knight at e1 to finish. So just about to finish the first match of the candidates in the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. It's going to go to Mugwort 6-4 over mastertan. And there will be 5 remaining matches in round 1. And we're going to see 6 games a week. That's the schedule. That's the plan. 6 games a week. My next match against Penguin GIM will be coming up very soon. So stay tuned for more exciting matches. Thanks for watching, everyone.